Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. We're less than 1 year away from the 2020 election and less than 100 days out from the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary. But Democrats in Washington are focusing on the final weeks of 2019. As these 2020 deadlines approach, the investigation into the current president is ramping up. The impeachment inquiry entered into a public stage today. The transcripts from two key closed-door depositions were released. The testimonies are from former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and Michael McKinley. He's a former senior advisor to the Secretary of State. Both were asked about whether President Trump inappropriately pressured Ukraine's president. Here's how House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff characterized what was learned.
But you also see in reading his transcript his growing alarm at the degree to which the apparatus of the State Department itself was being used to seek political information for a political purpose by the President of the United States and others.
Schiff says at least two more transcripts will be released later this week. Now some Republicans are demanding everything be made public to satisfy calls for more transparency.
All they've released to you are those parts of the transcript that are certainly most advantageous to their narrative. That being said, if they'll release everything in its full context, I certainly would applaud Adam Schiff for that, and that would be a start, well, a new start for transparency.
These developments come as President Trump doubles down on his claim that Democrats are using the inquiry to gain a political edge in 2020. He tweeted today that the probe is a, quote, Democrat hoax that I have had to live with from the day I got elected. For more, let's bring in our panel, Major Garrett, Natalie Andrews, and Keir Dougall. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent. Natalie is a congressional reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And Keir is a CBSN legal contributor and former assistant U.S. attorney in New York's Eastern District. Welcome to all of you. Major, I want to start with you.
Sure.
What were your main takeaways from Marie Yovanovitch's testimony?
That she was, as a career diplomat, concerned not only about a smear campaign against her that she didn't know the origins of or the motives behind, but also that the State Department apparatus, as she understood it as a Foreign Service officer, was, if not being misused, certainly warped in an unrecognizable way about these issues related to Ukraine and military aid, and she became increasingly skeptical and then suspicious about this outside apparatus, principally led by the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to get some interest in Ukraine, or maybe gin up is a better term, though she didn't use those words precisely, some kind of a series of investigations either into 2016 or into a potential linkage to Joe Biden through his son, Hunter Biden, and Burisma. All those things left her unsettled. She was also unsettled about the smear campaign against her, and that when she asked for some kind of statement from the Secretary of State to support her, she was told it would not be forthcoming. And when she asked in a sort of way, almost plaintively, what can I do? She said, she was told, well, you might tweet some support for the president. All of this is suggestive of an atmosphere that, A, she found to be alien and not helpful, to put it mildly, of pursuing U.S. diplomatic or national security interests in Ukraine, and decidedly out of the norms. Does that make it a crime? No. Does the president have the absolute authority to get rid of any ambassador for any reason or no reason? Yes, he does. Any president does. But looking at this testimony about her life as it became kind of unrecognizable to her based on her long service to our country in the Foreign Service, it is, I think, to put it mildly, if not criminal, not a high crime and a misdemeanor, certainly, by any estimate, Republican or Democrat, unsettling.
So I want to go back to a point Major made a moment ago, Keir, about Marie Yovanovitch's mention of Rudy Giuliani. And I want to read some of what she told lawmakers about the president's personal attorney. She said that Rudy Giuliani, quote, cut the ground out from underneath us, end quote, at the U.S. Embassy. How problematic is Giuliani's involvement getting for the White House?
Well, it's potentially very problematic because we have this core question to begin with. in whose interest was Mr. Giuliani acting? Was he acting in the president's personal interest as his personal attorney? There's been some suggestion, I think, by Mr. Giuliani that, in fact, he was authorized by the State Department and therefore he was being, pursuing the United States interest. Mr. Ambassador Yovanovitch's concerns about having legs cut out from underneath or suggest that he was not acting in a way that was to advance the United States interest because it was counter to her official role as the Ukraine ambassador. And in that circumstance, it fuels this narrative about potentially Mr. Giuliani being a cutout, being somebody who was pursuing this quid pro quo and this personal interest in the election and the investigation, perhaps based on false things in the Ukraine.
Natalie, I want to ask you about Michael McKinley. The transcript of his testimony was also released today. McKinley is the former senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I know you've reported on this. What new details did we learn from his statements to lawmakers?
Really, the detail that stood out was how much he wanted to see a statement made in favor, showing support. Not even, he didn't want it to be political, but he wanted some sort of brief statement showing support for former Ambassador Yovanovitch. And it outlined where he went and how he asked to get that. And just, he reached kind of a silent phase from Secretary of State Pompeo and did not get the response he wanted. And he said after being a diplomat for 37 years, he could not still be at the State Department, and he cited that it was because the State Department was becoming increasingly political.
And on that point, Keir, McKinley also testified he was concerned about, quote, bullying tactics being used at the State Department against officials who might cooperate in this inquiry. Yovanovitch told lawmakers she felt threatened by the president. Could this idea of intimidation pose legal problems for the president?
Sure. So the underlying issue there is there sort of obstructive conduct while the Congress is involved in an impeachment inquiry. And if you're feeling bullied, if you're feeling threatened, that's certainly something that could be construed as obstructive. And we know that Chairman Schiff and Nancy Pelosi have looked at the historical precedent of President Nixon being, or rather the Judiciary Committee voting out potential articles of impeachment on obstruction.
So in the meantime, you had 4 White House officials defying subpoenas and refusing to testify today. That includes John Eisenberg, a lawyer considered to be central to the investigation. Major, what is the White House saying about why, in particular, Eisenberg was not allowed to testify?
Because they asserted in documents today that John Eisenberg is a senior advisor to the president. His role was chief lawyer on the legal team advising the National Security Council. He was a senior advisor to the president. Therefore, he has absolute immunity. And in no way can Congress lawfully subpoena or compel his testimony. It's also worth noting that Eisenberg, along with another senior official within the National Security Council, Charles Kupperman, who was the deputy to former National Security Advisor John Bolton. Now, Kupperman has a legal case before the federal court saying, can I be compelled to testify under this particular impeachment inquiry? The court is reviewing that. It has been made clear that Eisenberg will respect the outcome of that proceeding. That proceeding is taking some time. I believe, if I remember correctly, Elaine, the court has said oral arguments will be heard December 10th. I don't think that date follows the timeline that House Democrats have in public articulated, meaning they're not going to wait for the federal courts to referee all of this. And if people don't come and don't respond to a subpoena provided by the House of Representatives, Democrats have said out loud more than once that will be considered as part of either an obstruction of justice article of impeachment or abuse of power article of impeachment.
So, Keir, let me ask you from a legal perspective, what more can you tell us about this claim of, quote unquote, absolute immunity? And as Major just pointed out there, I mean, this is not settled law.
Right, and this is a very aggressive legal position to take. So it's founded on this sort of core idea of the president as the unitary, sort of this almost monarchical type of an executive. It's true that all of the executive power is vested in the president, but our constitutional structure clearly sets up as we know, checks and balances. One of them is the ability of the House to conduct an impeachment inquiry, to look for wrongdoing, and to sort of sweepingly say that either on the theory of executive privilege or simply on the theory that you work for the president and so you're absolutely immune. That is a very aggressive strategy and legal theory.
Well, Natalie, what options do Democrats have now when it comes to compelling the White House to cooperate?
They really have the court system, which, as Major noted, they've been rolling through, but it seems like they want to really move forward without waiting for court rulings, even if they've had recent rulings that are on their side that have said they didn't need a vote to start the impeachment inquiry. The judge seemed very puzzled by Kupperman's argument that he didn't need to testify or that he was getting that he wanted to defy a subpoena. So while they're getting rulings, Nancy Pelosi wants to move this quickly. She doesn't want it to get tied up into courts. This is something that she would like to move expeditiously, as she said. The exact timeline, we don't know, but it does seem as though they're going to move much before the courts can rule.
And Keir, we're now entering this public phase of the impeachment probe. Help us understand, give us some context here. How significant is that public portion going to actually be to the legal component of this process?
Well, I think it's potentially very significant because if you'll have witnesses on camera in a public hearings, so that the voters, the people can, eyeball, see how they perform, judge their own credibility, the fairness of the questions. There have been some suggestions about changing wording in the transcripts that have been released. There have been complaints about the due process by the administration, the Republicans, and fairness of the process. All of that will be on public display, and if it's not handled well, then I think it will go badly for the Democrats. And if it is handled transparently and in a way that allows the witnesses to get to some of the core questions that we have, it may move the dial in terms of public perception of the inquiry.
But ultimately, Major, I mean, really, this is a political case that is going to be made. If ultimately it should come to the Senate for a trial, it will be the members of the Senate, which we know is a majority of Republicans at the moment.
Right. And to your point, Elaine, this is a quasi-legal process, meaning there are processes, and Republicans have complained almost on a criminal court level about the due process. The president's not afforded basic constitutional due process rights. Well, what's going on in the House right now is a House impeachment inquiry. It's a gathering of evidence. There is no special prosecutor. There is no independent counsel. So the House is gathering this information. And due process rights, ask any district attorney, ask any prosecutor, state or federal, due process rights are very limited in the investigatory phase. I think Keir will back me up on that. So that's one part of this. That's one part of this. But to your point about the politics of this, I don't think we should in any way, shape, or form overlook what happened last week when every single House Republican voted against the inquiry itself. That was not a foregone conclusion. I've talked to several Republicans, very senior Republicans in the House Republican leadership, who said that was not a foregone conclusion. That took a tremendous amount of hand-holding and arm linkages and communication strategy, not really driven by the White House, but driven internally. Not only as a matter of, well, where are we all going to stand, but how we stand and what effect that will have on the Senate Republicans. And I think, based on my conversation with senior House Republican leaders, they believe that was the most compelling argument of all. If we hold ranks, that will give the president a much better chance to not only prevail in the Senate, but have no Republican leakage there either. And cast this forward into the 2020 campaign as essentially one party against the other, the party that won the 2016 presidential campaign against the one that, from their point of view and their argumentation, is trying to undo the results of the 2016 election. Democrats would say, we're not trying to undo an election, we're trying to hold the winner of that election, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, accountable for actions that are not consistent with that role based on national security, based on trying to gain, as Keir indicated, something of personal gain while using either the bureaucracy or a sub-bureaucracy they're creating on the side to gain something personal while using the powers of the presidency. Democrats would say, we're not trying to undo anything. We're simply trying to hold an occupant of an office accountable based on our historical standards of conduct. That's going to be the contours, I think, of this argument.
So, Major, with that as our backdrop, CBS News has also learned that the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought, will not appear for his scheduled testimony later this week. We're dealing a lot with foreign policy when it comes to the inquiry. So, Major, why is the OMB such a critical part of this?
OMB, Office of Management and Budget, they are the choke point for federal funds. And if you are going to slow them up or hold them in abeyance for whatever reason, you check in with the Office of Management and Budget first. So there are really two narratives here that are going to clash, Elaine, and I got to them a second ago, but let me make them as clear as I possibly can. Republicans are preparing, and you've already begun to see this argument. Look, the aid was ultimately approved. Who cares if it was held in abeyance? And there was no investigation into Burisma or anything else launched in Ukraine, so there was no quid and there's no quo. So this is all about nonsense. That is sort of the larger Republican argument. When they say the facts haven't changed, the facts, the aid got approved and there was no investigation. What Democrats want to say is, well, that very well might be true in the grand scheme of things, but there are all these incredibly messy details in the middle where things were suggested or implied that had a personal gain or a potential personal gain for the president, and that is the essence. Not what ultimately happened or ultimately didn't happen, aid getting approved, investigations not being conducted, but this whole messy in-between area where was the power of the United States government being manipulated for personal gain. That's where the Democrats want to take this. I've given you an idea where Republicans want to take it.
So, Natalie, over the weekend, the attorney for the whistleblower told our Margaret Brennan that his client would answer questions in writing from House Republicans. What do we know, Natalie, about that possibility?
We don't know much other than that that's out there, that's been reported. And it remains to be seen how the Republicans will handle that. And it might be something that they choose to do as the investigation becomes more public, as things go into judiciary. They seem to be kind of having a wait-and-see pattern. So we'll definitely be checking in on that and seeing what Republicans choose to do.
All right, a lot to watch. Major Garrett, Natalie Andrews, and Keir Dougall, thank you all for your insight.